If you have your Bibles, I'm going to invite you to open to Genesis chapter 37. We're doing something a little bit different. I don't typically preach or do this with the text, but we're actually going to trace a character through about 8 or so chapters in Genesis, and the character is Judah. So rather than turning in your own Bible, this morning I'm going to encourage you to go with the bulletin because I've got it printed, and the chapters and the specific verses we're going to look at together. So we're going to begin in Genesis chapter 37, verse 25. That being said, let's stand for the reading of God's Word. Then they sat down to eat, and looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, with their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh, on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers listened to him. Then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up, and lifted him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. They took Joseph to Egypt. Chapter 38, verse 24. About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has been immoral. Moreover, she is pregnant by immorality." And Judah said, "Bring her out, and let her be burned." As she was being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law, "By the man to whom these belong, I am pregnant." And she said, "Please identify whose these are, the signet, and the cord, and the staff." Then Judah identified them and said, "She is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah." And he did not know her again. Chapter 44, verse 30. "Now therefore, as soon as I come to your servant my father, and the boy is not with us, then as his life is bound up in the boy's life, as soon as he sees that the boy is not with us, he will die. And your servants will bring down the gray hairs of your servant our father with sorrow to Sheol. For your servant became a pledge of safety for the boy to my father, saying, if I do not bring him back to you, then I shall bear the blame before my father all my life. Now therefore, please let your servant remain instead of the boy as a servant to my Lord. And let the boy go back with his brothers. For how can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? I fear to see the evil that would find my father." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Please take a seat. Perhaps a question you haven't thought about in a while, but why do we study and why do we read the Scriptures? And why is it a good thing? Why do we say this is actually a really good practice in our piety to study and read the Old Testament and the New Testament? Have you thought about that question in a while? Typically, one of the answers we get from both believers and even non-believers is this answer. Well, we study the Old and New Testaments to learn from other characters how to lead a moral life, how to be good people, how to be good followers of God. Do you see the problem with that? Which characters are you referring to? Which ones have consistency? Which ones are void of hypocrisy? Which characters in the Old and New Testament are perfect and worthy of emulation? Who are they, save Jesus? There aren't any. In other words, let me put it this way. If the purpose of reading the Scriptures, if the only purpose is to learn how to lead a moral life, then all we need are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. If that was the purpose, then that's all we need. But why do we have the Old Testament? Why do we have the letters in the New Testament? It's to see these other people. It's to hear these other stories. It's to almost witness in a very tangible and real way these tragedies that are coming upon these people, these immoral people. It's to go, I've done something like this in my life before. I actually have more in common with Abraham and his fear, with Judah and his self-preservation, with Jacob and his wrestling than maybe I would have admitted before. And it's to see that how these immoral people are being overwhelmed, shocked, wrecked by the grace of God in the midst of their immorality. In the midst of their lostness, in the midst of their transgressions, God intercedes with a great grace awakening. And these stories are all throughout the Old Testament and New Testament, so that when we read it, we'll go, that sounds like my story. That sounds like my sin. That sounds like my struggle. And if God is going to be kind enough and gracious to them, to change their families, to change their life, and to change their world, could he not do that for me? Because here's the problem. Change, starting to look more like Jesus, hurts. That's why we call them growing pains. They're not growing blessings, they're growing pains. Change, sanctification, this process of becoming more and more like Jesus hurts. It feels at the moment like abandonment. It feels like God is leaving you. It feels like God has abandoned you. That's what change feels like. And so when we read all these stories and when we find ourselves in their places, in their shoes, in their struggles, we go, how do I know that God is not going to abandon me? How do I know he's not going to leave me? Because he didn't leave Judah. He didn't leave Abraham. He didn't leave Hannah. We read them to find our stories and our struggles and our hope. And we're going to look at one of those this morning. This is the story of Judah. This is not going to cover all the bases, and that's okay. We're just going to hit some of the highlights. But if you're following along, 3 points this morning. We'll look at the cub, look at the test, and the lion. The cub, the test, and the lion. So the first point, the cub. The cub here is a reference to Judah, and I'm going to explain that a little bit later. But I want to look at Judah's life and how it's portrayed by the narrator, how it's portrayed by Moses here in Genesis. And I want to use 3 snapshots, and I want us to look at the life of Judah and go, where do we overlap? How is Judah's life like a mirror to us? And 3 snapshots I want to show you. First is this: Judah's issues, Judah's immorality, actually begins with his father Jacob. It begins with his dad. Imagine growing up in the dysfunctional family that Judah grew up in, okay? This is a bit hyperbole, but imagine it this way. Jacob had 4 wives, and never in Scripture is that promoted or taught as a good thing. It is always a bad thing. It gets later the kings into trouble, David and Solomon, and here it gets Jacob into great trouble. Jacob has 4 wives, and from these 4 wives, he has sets of sons that come from all 4 of them. Okay, so imagine the dinner table. Next to Jacob is his prize, his joy, his love. It's Rachel. And next to her are the apples of his eye, his favorite children, Joseph and Benjamin. And not only are they at the head of the table, they get special clothes. They look different than the rest of the brothers, of which Judah is one, right? And so not only non-verbally are you, Judah, and your brothers and your sister a little further down the table. You're not as cherished and not as joyed in as they are. Not only do you feel your father's lack of approval, but he doesn't love your mom either. I mean, Genesis says that Leah was hated. She's the hated wife. So not only do you feel overlooked, but your mom is overlooked. And you're watching, Rachel get everything. You're watching Benjamin and Joseph get doted upon and get loved on, and you're at the back of the table. And this is not just a one and done. This is Judah's upbringing. This is his environment. This is the years where these formative years where you're learning just the basic fundamentals about what it means to be a human being. And what you hear over and over, verbally and non-verbally, is that you're not valuable. You are no Joseph, and you are no Rachel. It's not hard for some of you to imagine because some of you grew up in an environment like that. How do you cope with something like that? Judah copes this way. With this lack of approval, with this lack of favor, Judah decides to kind of take matters and justice into his own hands, right? We've read this passage before, but we read it again. Chapter 37, verse 26. Judah says to his brother, it's Judah who suggests this. What profit is it we kill our brother and conceal his bread? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites. In other words, let's just not leave him for dead. This is not, him being somewhat conscionable. But let's sell him. We can actually make a profit. We can actually earn some money from selling our younger brother. This is cold. Let me illustrate this way. A number of years ago, a movie came out by Martin Scorsese. It's called The Departed. And Matt Damon, who plays a character, and Jack Nicholson, who is a co-star in this movie, talked about this when they were filming the movie, this scene that Jack Nicholson kind of rewrote on the fly. Because he's a veteran in the movie world and in Hollywood, he had the clout to do it. So it's Matt Damon, Jack Nicholson, Martin Scorsese. There's a scene where Jack Nicholson's the bad guy, and he's supposed to execute this rival. And the scene is set up this way. All you see are kind of like silhouettes in the background. You see Jack Nicholson pull out a gun, execute the bad guy. And it's far enough out in the distance to where it's not graphic. It's not gratuitous. You're not supposed to see it. And Jack Nicholson came up to Martin Scorsese and he says, no. That's not cold enough. You need to zoom in. And so the camera was now 10 feet away. And he told Martin, he said, and don't make the person I execute a man, make it a woman. And put her on her knees, facing away from me. And then when I pull the trigger, here's what I'm going to say. I'm changing the script. Here's what I'm going to say. I'm going to say, boy, she fell funny. And Matt Damon said, I was in shock. Not only that Jack would even suggest that, but just the coldness of the suggestion. Judah is Jack Nicholson. He's colder than cold. Entirely disregarding of the value of his brother to his father. Doesn't just try to get rid of him, but tries to make a profit off of his brother. Does this sound familiar? Does this story, kind of ring any bells? It should. Remember the story of Jacob that we looked at just a few weeks ago? Remember what Jacob did. Jacob pretended to be somebody else in order to get the favor from his father. He took matters into his own hands. My father loves Esau, my brother, but in order to get that blessing, that treasure, that value from him, I'm going to pretend to be somebody else. I'm going to pretend to be him. You see what Judah's doing here in this passage? I mean, somebody cue Hank Williams, Family Tradition, right? That should be playing in the background. He's doing exactly what his dad did. Same song, different verse. Instead of pretending to being something else, he's just selling off his brother. And hopes that if his brother is out of the picture, then maybe, quite possibly, that favor that I long for, that I want, and that I desire will then be given to me. Maybe with him gone, I'm going to take matters in my own hands, and it's cold. And it's brutal. That's why we say in our circles so often, hurt people hurt people. Canceled people cancel people. Overlooked people overlook people. This isn't watertight, but why, are you starting to see some of the same repetitions, some of the same habits in your family now being manifested in your children that you experienced from your parents? It's because it's a family tradition. It's a cycle. Hurt people hurt people. Cancel people. Something's got to break. Something has to stop the cycle. Something has to intervene with a great grace and a great mercy and stop that cycle, right? We can't stop there. There's a number of other things to look at in Judah's life. The last thing I want to look at that's negative is chapter 38. keeping the theme of country songs, if the last point was Hank Williams' family tradition, this third snapshot is the song "Looking for Love in All the Wrong Places," right? Judah is seeking an earthly value. He's seeking an earthly answer to an earthly problem. He doesn't have the approval of his father. He's grown up feeling overlooked and devalued. And so he's got an earthly problem, and he's looking to solve it with an earthly answer, right? So what does he do? Here's the context of chapter 38, because I couldn't print it all in here. Judah has gotten married. He's found a wife. And from his wife, he has born 3 sons. The first son's name is the second is Onan, and the third is Shelah. And pretty soon after his sons are born, his wife dies. And after she dies, Judah promises his oldest son, a wife, and her name was Tamar. And we don't know anything more about except that he was a wicked man, and because he was wicked, God killed him. And so, because of tradition, the wife is then passed to the second son to give his older brother children, right? And Onan knew this, and Onan went to particular lengths to make sure that Tamar would not become pregnant. And when he did this in the sight of God, it was wicked, and God kills Onan. Judah is a very wounded man. He's already lost his wife. He's lost his two oldest sons, and now he's got one left. So what do you think he's going to do with that son? He's going to protect him, right? He thinks the problem is not his sons. He thinks the problem is the wife, Tamar. So what does he do? He says, you go back to your parents' house. You go back to your father's home. Go live with your dad again. And when Shelah is old enough, I will give him to you in marriage. And what we find out later in Genesis is that he never meant to fulfill that promise. Judah lied to Tamar. So what does Tamar do? She finds out that Judah's coming into town. So she puts a veil over her face, hides her identity, and just happens to be on the road where he's walking by. And he solicits her thinking that she is a prostitute when it's actually his daughter-in-law. He solicits her for sex. And she says, well, what will you give me if I give you my body? And he says, well, I'll give you a lamb. A young goat. I'll give you a young goat. But he's like, I don't have it with me. And so she says, well, what will you give me then as a pledge for this young goat? And he says, well, what do you want? She says, give me your staff, give me your signet, give me your ring. It's likely that all 3 of those were attached onto one thing. And give it to me as your pledge. And he said, agreed. And so they went into the bedroom, and we find out later that Tamar becomes pregnant from her father-in-law. And he doesn't know it's her. And then we get to chapter 38. And let me reread this again. And this is what unfolds after her pregnancy. About 3 months later, Judah was told, Tamar, your daughter-in-law has been immoral. Moreover, she is pregnant by immorality. And Judah said, bring her out and let her be burned. All right, he doesn't know it. He's about to have a David and Nathan moment. You are that man, right? And as she was being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law, Judah, by the man to whom these belong, those 3 things being the ring, the signet, and the staff, I am pregnant. And she said, Judah, please identify who these are, the signet and the cord and the staff. And then Judah realized, that's me. I'm that man. And for the first time in Judah's life, we get just a moment, a glimpse of him being rational, of him being grounded, of understanding really what's happening in the world. She's actually, even though she pretended to be a prostitute, she's actually more righteous than I. 2 things I want you to see about Judah in this passage. The first one is this. It's pure usury. We talked about this when we were discussing sexual temptation. The best sex is married sex. It's because the physical is just part of what it means to be married. As two bodies come together to become one, so two wallets come together to be one. Two wills come together to be one. Two hearts, two affections come together to be one. But usury says, I don't want your will, I don't want your emotions, I don't want your heart, I just want your body. I'm separating the physical away from the emotional and the spiritual and the financial. I'm unnaturally separating those things from each other. And I don't want you. I don't want your secrets. I don't want your background. I don't want your gifts. I don't want your fellowship, your companionship. I just want your body. In the Old Testament culture, and even in our day-to-day, if you're a guy, you can get sex whenever you want. You feel entitled to it. He felt entitled to it. And he's using her. And the second thing I want us to see about him is what one scholar has called the shift and shield. Another way to call this is the distract and the displace. And here's what the shift and shield is. The real problem here was Judah's sons. They were wicked. It wasn't Tamar. She didn't do anything wrong. As far as we know, she was a model wife. But his oldest son died. And then his second son died. And what he assumed was, the problem is her. And I'm sending her away. Do you see the shift? Right? The problem's not me. The problem's not my line. The problem's not me and my boys. The problem's her. I'm removing her from this equation. And therefore salvaging my son. Salvaging my line. Shielding himself from his own wickedness by focusing on hers. Do you see the shift and shield, the displace, the distract? It's not until he is brought out into the light, he has that David-Nathan moment, that he realizes that the real problem was not Tamar. It wasn't her, it was him. It was the wickedness in his own heart. And like I said, we just get a little glimpse of that when he says, she's more righteous than I. Now, how do we know that this sticks? How do we know that this is one of those seeds like Jesus talks about in his parable that isn't snatched, by a bird or isn't scorched by the sun, that has the ability to take root? How do we know that Judah is really starting to make a turn here? Well, if you want to know if someone is genuine, if someone is true, you put them through a test, right? That's exactly what happens in chapter 44. Joseph, Judah's younger brother, puts Judah and his brothers through a test. And now here's the context. Remember, there's been a famine in Egypt and across multiple countries across the empire. And Jacob said to his sons, "We have no grain. Here are sackfuls of money and empty sacks to carry grain back with you. Go to Egypt, go to Pharaoh, buy grain." And they do. And what they don't realize is that instead of seeing Pharaoh, they see his second in command. This empire is the largest empire at the time. What they don't realize is that they go before their brother, Joseph, and they say, my paraphrase, "We need grain." And he gives them grain, takes their payment, but then he hides the payment back in their sacks so they actually don't pay for it. And at several times during the conversation, Joseph is overwhelmed by his brothers, having not seen them for so long, and he actually has to excuse himself to go in the back room to cry and to weep. But he comes back out and says, "Is this all of you?" Knowing full well that it wasn't. And they said, "Well, this is all except our youngest brother, Benjamin." And he said, "If you ever need any more help, come back, but don't come back unless you bring Benjamin." Because that's going to be Joseph's test. What kind of brothers are his brothers now? Years later, perhaps decades later, what kind of brothers are his brothers now? And what he foresaw happened. They ran out of grain, and they come back again a second time with empty sacks and with bags of money from Jacob. But this time they bring Benjamin. And Jacob was fearful, because remember, Benjamin is his treasure. He's already lost Joseph. He can't lose Benjamin. And he hems and he haws in front of his other sons, but he says, "You better bring him back. I can't live without Benjamin." So the brothers come back to Egypt before Joseph with Benjamin this time, and the same thing happens. He fills up their sacks with grain, puts the money sacks back in there, but he gives him a test. He takes his goblet, his cup, and he puts it in the sack of Benjamin. And he sends them off, unbeknownst to the brothers or Benjamin. And after they get a certain way down the road, Joseph says to his captain, I want you to go chase them down. I want you to stop and look in all of their sacks, find out who stole my cup, who stole my chalice, and then bring them back before me. And so the captain goes out and does exactly what Joseph tells him to do. Brings them back, they unload the sacks, and they find out that Benjamin is the one who stole, quote unquote, the cup. And Joseph says, again, my paraphrase, how could you do such a wicked thing before me? You all may go back, but I'm keeping here as payment Benjamin, your younger brother, as my servant for this great evil that you've done in my presence. I'm keeping Benjamin. Do you see how brilliant this is of Joseph? Joseph's not being cruel. He's not being unforgiven. He is in a very Solomon-like way, in a very wise way, going, what kind of brothers are my brothers now? Here's the test. A long time ago, the test was this. Joseph was offered for 20 shekels of silver so that other brothers might flourish and prosper. Here, Joseph is offering the same test that his brothers failed with him so many years ago. Are they going to sacrifice their younger brother for their own sake? Will they leave? Will they go home? Will they let Benjamin stay a servant of Egypt's number 2 man who just happens to be their brother? And you know what happens? Chapter 44, verse 30. Now therefore, this is Judah speaking. Look back at the text, verse 30. Now therefore, as soon as I, Judah, come to your servant my father Jacob, and the boy Benjamin is not with us, if I go home without Benjamin, then as his life is bound up in the boy's life, and as soon as he sees that the boy is not with us, he will die. And your servants will bring down the gray hairs of your servant our father with sorrow to hell. In other words, if I go home and Benjamin is not with me, my dad will die, maybe not physically, but spiritually. Life will be utter hell for him. In every sense of the word. You will crush my father. Verse 32. For your servant, being me, Judah, became a pledge of safety for the boy Benjamin to my father Jacob, saying, if I do not bring him back to you, then I, Judah, shall bear the blame before my father all of my life. Now therefore, please let your servant, me, Judah, remain instead of the boy as a servant to my Lord, and let the boy go back with his brothers. Who is this guy? Who is this? This is not the Judah we know. This is not the Judah who is so cold that he would sell his brother into slavery for money, who would try to push his wickedness onto somebody else, a victim, a widow, his own daughter-in-law in society. Who is this man? Do you see what he's doing? He's offering himself. He's saying, instead of Benjamin, instead of the beloved son of my father, take me as your servant. Take the older brother as a sacrifice in place of the younger brother. This is a different person, a different man entirely. That's the test. And he passes with flying colors. So much so that Joseph can't contain himself. He excuses himself again to go into a back room and weep because this is not the Judah he knew. This is someone different entirely. That's the test. What's the lion? I didn't print this verse. I just want you to listen to it. Judah finally gets his blessing from Jacob. He finally gets the good words. He finally gets the favor. No longer is he overlooked, but it doesn't come until Genesis chapter 49. That's another 5 chapters after the verse we just read. Listen. In the same way that Isaac blessed Jacob so long ago, now Jacob gathers all his sons, and he says to Judah, things he doesn't say to Reuben, who is the oldest. He doesn't say to Benjamin or to Joseph, who are his treasures. No, he says to Judah things he doesn't say to any of the other sons. He's singled out. Listen to what God says, what Jacob says to his son Judah. Genesis 49, verse 8. Judah, your brothers shall praise you, and your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your enemies' hands aren't going to be on your neck. Your hand is going to be on their neck. You're going to win. You're going to be victorious. Your father's sons shall bow down before you. They will honor you. They will respect you. You're not going to be overlooked anymore. Judah. Verse 9, Judah is a lion's cub. From the prey, my son, you've gone up. Not down, but up. Finally, those words from his dad, he's been so longing to hear after this great change in his life. It's interesting how Genesis, this first book of the Bible, references, in terms of a promise, in terms of a blessing, a lion's cub. Here's why that's interesting, because the last book of the Bible, Revelation, written by an entirely different author, makes a similar reference. This is what John says in Revelation 5, verse 4. Listen. And I, being John, began to weep loudly, because no one was found worthy to open the scroll or to look into it. And one of the elders said to me, weep no more. Grieve no more. Don't be sorrowful. Why? Behold, the Lion from the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has conquered, has finished it, so that he can open the scroll and he can open the seven seals. If you go back and you look at Matthew's genealogy at the beginning of his gospel, do you remember how it goes? It starts early in Genesis with Adam, Abraham, with Isaac, Jacob. But then from there it goes to Judah. The line follows Judah to Tamar. Tamar, the woman who positioned herself as a prostitute before her father-in-law, is in the genealogy of Jesus. And from her came Perez, who from him came David, who from him further and further on down the line would come Jesus. You see what's happening from Genesis to Revelation? In Genesis, we have this cub, this one who would offer himself as a substitute and a sacrifice so that his younger brother may live. But then we get to Revelation and we hear of not of a cub, but of the Lion himself, who would offer himself as a sacrifice for many, not just so that we become sons and daughters, so that we might become one with him. Judah's the cub, but Jesus is the greater Judah, the greater substitute, the greater sacrifice. He is the Lion. Friends, do you know what this means? A couple things to chew on before we close. Let me illustrate it first with a story. I want to introduce you to a man named Daryl Davis. And you can find his documentary on Amazon Prime. It's called Accidental Courtesy. And it's a documentary about him. And he has spent the last 30 years befriending members of the KKK. Whether through email, through social media, or even in person, he has befriended hundreds, if not thousands, of people who were or are currently in the extremist group, the KKK, the white supremacy group, the KKK. And what's so amazing about this story is that in his befriending of them, he's talked over 200 of them out of this movement. And not only has he talked them out of this movement through his friendship with them, as kind of a symbol of these men and women leaving their old life behind, their life of hatred and bigotry. A number of these men and women have given Daryl their robes. And he's got a closet and now a storage unit full of these tokens that as a sign of them to kind of like changing entirely, starting anew. Take these robes, take them from me. You have them as a token. I'm leaving this old way, this old life behind, and I'm starting something new. And in this documentary, he walks you through the storage unit. And they're different colors because they're different ranks. Some of them are higher officials, and some of them are just little peons. But all ranks, all class, all kinds of members from the KKK. As amazing as that story is, that's not the most amazing thing about it. Daryl's black. Daryl's African American. I'll show you, I thought I brought it up here. He's an African American. He is a jazz pianist. See him there? He's a jazz pianist. He's played for famous people like B.B. King. So he's not just some rookie, some novice. He's a very well-educated, very well-gifted, well-connected man. But he has spent the last 30 years of his life befriending people that if we were in his shoes, we would be right to hate. We would be right to wag a finger. We would be right to say, you've separated yourself from me, well, I'm going to separate myself from you. But instead, he chose a different path. He said, I'm going to befriend you. Instead of judgment, instead of anger, even though it would be right and it would be just to do so, I want to be your friend. And I'm not going to look down to you. I'm actually going to look up to you. I'm going to respect you. I'm going to give you things. I'm going to value you, even though you may not reciprocate and you don't feel the same way about me. Daryl is a beautiful picture of Jesus Christ. In this, the reason why trials in life are so hard and it feels like struggling, it feels like God is abandoning us, because what he is showing us is our Judah hearts. And to truly see our Judah hearts, we can't be told. We can't be convinced rationally. I can't rationalize you into your awareness of sin. We cannot be told. We have to be shown. We have to have those moments where we are brought low, where we're caught. And in those moments, it feels like we're being abandoned. It feels like we're alone. It feels like we're by ourselves. We feel like an exposed nerve. But let me ask you this. What caused Judah to change? Was it just time? Was it just maturity? No, it was a keen, severe awareness of his own wickedness and immorality. He couldn't be told. He had to be shown, and so do we. I can't tell you you're sinful, you're broken. I'm not going to try to convince you of it. Life will. God will. He'll put experiences in life where that is exposed to you. But do you know what your hope is? Is that in moments like that, Jesus is like Daryl. He's not going to wag a finger. He's going to say, I offer you friendship. I come to you in friendship. But you got to deal with the things that have just been exposed. You got to say like Judah, I'm not as righteous as I thought I was. She's more righteous than I. There's got to be admission of it. There's got to be a lowliness to you. This is what changes Judah. Friends, this is what changes Judah's family. This is what changes the world. Before Joseph, in this worldwide empire, this is what changes the world. It's not his goodness, it's not his righteousness, it's his lowliness and his willingness to admit it and to embrace it. Do you see the irony there? Do you want to change the world? Do you want to change your family? Do you want to change yourself? Go low. It becomes with a keen and severe awareness of our immorality and our brokenness, not of our goodness, not of our gifts, not of our strengths, not of our wisdom. It's low. That's what changes him. That's what changed their whole family and the world. Briefly, if it's not obvious already, regardless of how dysfunctional your family is, regardless of how dysfunctional your life is and your approval seeking is in your life, you are not beyond the reach, the friendship of Jesus Christ. If he can take Judah, change him, change his family, and change the world through him, can he not do that for you? Absolutely. He offers you his friendship. What that means for us as a church, and especially as a church plant, New City members and visitors have to be better with a mirror than a megaphone. We've got to be better with a mirror than a megaphone. Do you see the difference? Mirror does what? It exposes you. It allows you to see what needs to change in you. But right now, it feels like everybody's got a megaphone. I'm not calling you out. But right now, with everything that's going on in the world, everybody's got a microphone through social media, through emails. Everybody's got a microphone. New City members, visitors, guests, put down the megaphone. Do you want to change the world? You want to change your city? You want to change your family? Start with a mirror. That's where real change begins. That's where real change happens. Is when you see your wickedness, when you see your immorality, you go to God with it and say, my friend, Jesus, help. Change this in me. Give me a new heart. Give me a new appetite. Give me new desires. Is that how you read the Old Testament? Is that how you read the New Testament? Is that how you read all these old characters in the Old Testament? These people. There's only one hero that Judah and Darrell point us to, and that's Jesus. He wants to call you friend. He's reaching for you. Will you reach back? Let's pray. Father, this one's a bitter pill to swallow. We want to lead with our best foot. We want to leave the house and our work with our righteousness on our sleeve. We want people to see us as good and as moral people, but we've been fooling no one but ourselves. So in measures that don't overwhelm us, and in your great mercy and in grace, would you awaken us to the things that we need to deal with, our own sins, our own struggles, and from there, would you change us? Would you change our families? Would you change our city and our church? And through it, would you change our world? That we might not boast in ourselves, in anything, any power or wisdom, that we might boast in Jesus Christ, his work, his life, and the sweet words that he said on the cross. It is finished. Help us to believe that. Be the object of our faith. And we ask this all in Christ's name. Amen.